Okay, so I am going to introduce Carmen Ostermann. She is our arts member, and she's from Edgewood, Kentucky. She's a fine artist who was raised in the United States, Canada, Japan, and the Philippines. In 2015, she received her BFA in ceramics and sculpture at the University of Cincinnati. Afterwards, she taught at the School for Creative and Performing Arts, Stivers School for Arts, and A+ Children's Academy. Osterman is the recipient of the Wolfstein Travel Fellowship, which was in Frankfurt, Germany, and the Ohio Designer Craftsman Scholarship, and the Greater Columbus Arts Council Individual Grant. She completed her MFA at the College of Art and Design and was awarded the Art at Audubon Arts Residency in 2022. Her work has been featured in the Roger Torrey Peterson Institute of Natural History, the Priscilla R. Tyson Cultural Arts Center, the Ohio Craft Museum, the Sandra J. Blaine Gallery, and Manifest Gallery. She taught ceramics at Capital University and is the administrative and project coordinator at the Columbus Audubon Center. Excuse me. Blending her love of art, education, and conservation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Carmen and take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Okay, well, we will just get right into it. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to give you a bit of background and just talk about my journey, and then, of course, about clay and the materials I'm working with. So I have images here of places that have really influenced my art making because I've spent portions of my life in them. As she introduced me, you heard about like all the different places I was growing up. And something that I found was that I was really drawn to the natural environments and then also thinking about these crazy cityscapes. And that is really what guided me in my early work. This is some work I'm going to show you from undergrad in which I was using metal and wood a lot. And I was thinking about nature versus man-made materials. In this piece, I was working in a foundry and I poured liquid aluminum onto a piece of live edge wood. And in doing so, it soaked through all the pores and all the cracks and everything and it just created this blending. And I'm always thinking about how the natural world and the human-made world are existing together. And then I also incorporated this architectural element with all the little homes. Um, this is an example of the same process, except I was able to separate the aluminum and wood. So they were two separate pieces. The first one, the aluminum adhered and went straight through it, whereas here you can see the beautiful patina of the aluminum on that wood surface. And then this insane reaction that happens when you have a natural material and then this human made thing and thinking about I was already at this beginning stage thinking a lot about nature and destruction and human activity, which is why I like to show it. And I was also very attracted to clay and birds. And it wasn't until the end of my undergraduate degree that I started working in ceramics and just absolutely fell in love with clay. This is one of my first few of my first pieces in which I was making birds and at this point I was also like putting them on these fabric embroidered kind of bases. And so I've always been thinking about clay and then this journey I'm on of how to incorporate fiber and clay, how to blend those two materials. Um, I would like to include, I'll sprinkle some influences in here throughout my presentation because it's how we make, right? We're so influenced by the world around us and by incredible other scientists and makers. An example here I'm showing is Roxy Laybourne, who was one of the lead curators at the Smithsonian, and you can see their collection of, bird specimens. And it was just so impactful to me to be thinking about how we collect nature, how we try to harness and control and understand it, and how beautiful it is, but how destructive that can be. So that was a big theme I was kind of thinking about and working with. And this book I always have to put out there, but if you haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. Robin Wall Kimmerer is amazing and dives into all of these things that are really influential in my work. So, how are we having a relationship with nature and using science, but also she dives into, as she is a Indigenous person, Indigenous wisdom and a more spiritual and relationship side with nature. Um, and speaking of like the science and art and nature parts, just highly influenced by any scientific illustrators. Here are two amazing ones, one of which, Genevieve Estelle Jones, a beautiful book, all these illustrations of nests. She's from Ohio, and just has gorgeous work. So very grateful to everything that I'm consuming and being influenced by. So with all of these influences, I was really diving into and looking at lots of bird species. And my first step with making is like lots of research. I always talk about how similar to science, like lots of research, imagery outside, trying to find them, trying to understand them, and then illustrations, drawing, and eventually making in the three-dimensional form. So you can see here, I started choosing all these different species and I was making them in these taxidermied forms. And this was in 2020. And it was, I mean, it felt like I was going in the right direction, but it was depressing, and that was getting to it a bit, but it just wasn't pushing it where I wanted it to go. And simultaneously, I was doing these fiber stitching embroidery works of lots of different plants that were in these environments that these birds were in, um, and just like mushrooms, fungi, all these different things. And I was also making them in clay. So these two things were happening separately. And as you've seen in my work, they eventually come together. So I got away a bit from the taxidermied birds and I started moving into, I wanted them to be more lively. I wanted to make ceramic work where there was more movement. And these nodes started growing on my bird species. And essentially the way that I think about these little growths that you can see on all these different birds, is that I look at the foliage that's in the area of the bird, or sometimes in some cases, if they're seashore birds, I'll look at coral, just any kind of inspiration for what's in their environment. And I will take those and make these little nodes and have these growths on the birds. And specifically, I like to look at types of microorganisms that are the first to come after destruction. So the language for that is ecological succession. And I could really dive into that and like the scientific aspect of it. But that is really what was inspiring this. And at first it was just these like a few little growths, but eventually, as you see, it gets more and more. And that kind of goes into the meaning as well. And I experimenting with like how to display them. So putting them in an epoxy disc or putting them in a wooden base or making an embroidery base. So once again, trying to figure out how to blend materials. I also like to show once again just like how important illustration is to me. These are illustrations on vellum of some of the different species I was doing. I like to do lots of them in different positions and flight patterns and layer them and explore two-dimensionally before diving into the three-dimensional. And this was installed at the Cultural Arts Center show, showing 10 of the clay pieces I had there, but the illustrations that came about first. And that study and that like time and respect shown to the species and trying to really get to understand them is just, I think, like an important part of my process. So I really appreciate that time to get to know the creature that I'm working with. And I think it's just kind of humbling with how incredible they are. Um, and simultaneously, I was starting to do embroidery and playing with that. And once again, all of these nodes is the word I use a lot for them, but these plant, fungi, coral kind of inspired things from their environments started appearing in embroidery. And I was layering illustrations and embroidery, and that's just a big theme in my work is trying to figure out how to blend materials. I like experimenting a lot in that way. And this is another piece from that same show, in which I had those embroidered different specimens. The circle definitely lends itself to like a microscope and looking into these microorganisms. Yeah. And here's an image of like it's just the accumulation and starting to make more and more of these studies. And yeah, just diving into and really trying to see different ways to display these different positions and different explorations of how much of this growth. And it's kind of, I feel like what I was excited about was sometimes these growths, they look beautiful, but they're also somewhat disturbing. And eventually it gets to be like, oh my gosh, something's really wrong here. So I'm searching for this like uncanny feeling almost of, okay, what's going on here? What's this relationship? And making us reflect a bit on our own relationship with the natural world. And I like to show this piece because eventually it's getting to the point where the nodes were taking over the work. So all of a sudden it was just like you could see a wing or a head emerging like you can with this blue throat bird. But then this complete consumption is occurring. And just creating a different feeling than the first few pieces. And I'd like to see that progression and show that feeling of destruction essentially and beauty, like all occurring simultaneously. Here's an image from that exhibit of a lot of those pieces displayed with different materials. Many of you may have seen this as you like work there or you just go through that space. And I'll touch on that show a little bit later in the presentation. Uh, Going to influences again, some modern, I was speaking about some scientific and historical influences, but some modern contemporary artists that I really like are listed here. I'm always trying to look at contemporary work and get inspired by it. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mark Dion, Kate McGuire, and Marjolaine Dallinga. The they just all are having conversations about nature, and I like seeing what materials they're exploring as well. So I could dive into this, but I'm going to just go over these and just shout out as I think it's so important to be looking at and thinking about what artists are doing. I also have Courtney Matson here, another ceramic artist. Her work is coral based, and many of you have seen this. And then, of course, she's talking about the coral bleaching, which is absolutely an influence in my work too. As you've seen, they are all like white pieces. And she's showing that color coral getting, moving out and eventually getting bleached and the death that's occurring there. And then on the right, Alexis Rockman's amazing. And I love looking at artists who are like also very educational based. So if you ever get to see their work, they have these massive paintings and all of these paintings, they've labeled everything so that you can see which species are which and how they're getting impacted and what the natural events are that are occurring. And this was a piece about the Great Lakes. So just incredible artists and great inspiration. And I am going to just pull a little excerpt from some of my writing here. I'll read this. I think it'll give some context to my work, and it's actually the title of that exhibit I had at the Cultural Arts Center. I am one of those animals. So this is just my writing. We are currently experiencing the Anthropocene extinction, the ongoing sixth great mass extinction in which a large number of living species are threatened or eliminated entirely due to environmentally destructive human activities. Considering that this is the first biotic crisis caused by an animal and not by a natural event, and that I am one of those animals, has strongly steered me towards my current practice. Birds have been hit hard as their population has lowered by 3 billion since the 1970s. That's approximately a one-third of all birds. They simply cannot survive the swift alterations humans are inflicting in their environments. Since the 1500s, humans have entirely eliminated more than 150 bird species. No other class of vertebrates has suffered more extinctions. So this, consuming and thinking about this information is like hugely impactful to me, and thinking about being a human and my role in the world, right? So that kind of has really steered my practice. In regards to materials, as I've kind of touched on, I love experimenting, as I know many of you do. Working with lots of different, like for me, fiber and clay is what I'm particularly interested in right now, and illustration is a great tool to get to the three-dimensional aspect that I'm working on. And I work with porcelain. So those earlier works I was showing you, those were all in stoneware, and I was painting them white after I had fired them. Whereas you're going to start seeing here, I'm starting to experiment now with. I'm sorry, I don't know if I said that right. It was stoneware I was painting. Now I'm starting to experiment with porcelain. And I was so excited about the surface of porcelain once I started using it, and not having to paint it and getting the color and the surface that I wanted. So I've really enjoyed and been excited to be working sculpturally in porcelain. Once again, blending of materials. So I just got a sewing machine that I'm really excited about, and I'm excited to be experimenting more and more with fiber and just figuring out how to combine it with clay. So I'm always saying that to see who else is doing that and how they're doing it. And these are just similar kind of like microorganism studies and experiments. If you go into my studio, illustration is just like a huge part. You saw kind of some of the vellum, like more finalized illustrations, but sketching and drawing things out is essential for me to get to the three-dimensional piece. So these are just some illustrations from my studio and ideation. Whereas these are, once I select a species, I really like to study that species and draw them and look at them in various forms. And that's kind of what's going on here. Um, and this is a really large piece I worked on. It's a sleeping swan, and I like to show it because I start pushing the um, the fiber and clay relationship. So this swan is on a huge wooden board, and it appears as if it's hanging from these thousands of individual threads that are um, literally like woven into the holes that I pre-made before I fired the sleeping swan. The swan is in fact epoxied to the board, but there's a tension that's happening there and then a connection to the fiber that I was really excited about and I'm interested in exploring more. Um, the only issue with it, as with all of my work, is that it is just so insanely, doing something like this is so insanely time consuming and tedious to have done like these individual threads. And but I think the look of it is stunning. So I was excited about that. And then speaking of clay, and just the title of my talk today, I love thinking about clay and how much I love this relationship with this natural material I'm trying to use to show natural species and this relationship, this human relationship with the natural world. And once again, just an excerpt from my writing. Working with clay feels like having a love affair with time. It's heavy, but also fragile. And if the making process is not timed properly, it will crack and break. And whenever I speak to artists, I really like to show my process, because as an artist, that's what I love to see, speaking when I see other artists present. So I'm going to show a little bit of like the tediousness of working with clay, and the risks of timing and everything like that. So here I decided to show the process of the whipping cream piece, which I had in our show all together. So hopefully that's interesting for those of you who are able to see that work. It's the one that was like the pillar piece with the one bird on it, rather than there was another one that was like two smaller birds that looked more figurine like. This was life size of this bird. So with these pieces, I start off by making these large pillar forms, and I have to hollow them out. Everything has to be hollow. And after I make this pillar form, I incorporate and make all of the selected species parts. So here you can see very rough start, the wing, a wing, the head, the neck. And then I go in and I have to spend time just cleaning them up and making the all of the carving and all of the aspects of making them look more realistic. So here I have the head on the left and working on the beak and then a wing, carving in all the feathers and talon on the side. And something that is so essential with this process is that when you first make all of these pieces, as you can see in this image, these have actually been sitting already for a long time. The porcelain's so soft when I first start working with it. So there's an element of letting it set and giving it time to get, more and more firm, but not enough time to dry out. So it's a really a delicate balance with like moisture and cracking. And I love it when it gets to this point where it's getting not like leather hard, but a little bit stronger, and I can really carve in the details and start adding all of these aspects. And then eventually, after I've added a lot of the details, but not all of them, because you have to manhandle the wings and the neck and everything, you slip and score those onto the pillar. So I've taken those now and I've slip and scored, which I'm assured most of you know, but that's just carving into, and you'll see some closer up images of that later. Making a lot of cross hatches into the clay and making it wet on both sides and sticking it together like a glue. And you'll notice too in some of the images that there's some paper towels wrapped around the bird's beak or the tip of a wing because these pieces that are like smaller and hanging off, they are drying at a different rate and pace than the rest of the work. So it's just like really essential that I'm always like touching. It's so sensual and so physical that to be touching and feeling the temperature, the wetness, the moisture, and seeing that it's all kind of drying at the same rate. It's a very delicate process, as most things are in art. And and then after I connected those, the head and the neck and the wings and clean them up a bit, I start going in and adding these nodes, which I brought up earlier as the ecological succession, these inspired flora and fungi and all these different things from the habitat of the whooping crane. And yeah, it's each node I make by hand, just like um the carved pieces. So I'm doing everything with my hands. My favorite tool is like an X-Acto knife. But it's mostly done with my hands and with a few carving tools. And yeah, it's a lot of fun and it's extremely just slow and tedious, but it's this space you get into where you are kind of doing the same thing and it can be magical, right? It's just this like flow state that I know you all know about. So yeah, taking my time and going through and adding all of those. And I started doing this thing with my work at this time where I started creating like caverns, which I was excited about, like these holes that were happening in the pillars so that it looked like it was almost like decaying. So there's this like bird coming out and there's parts where it's actually going all the way in. And my husband had this lovely idea to like have the talons wrapping out, as you might be able to see on the left side, wrapping out and coming out of one of those decaying areas. So yeah, so at this point, it's like, okay, all of these, the surface is what I want it to be. All of these nodes are on, and it needs to start drying. And what's so tricky about this is that it needs to dry at the same rate. And that's why in the middle photo, you can see there are two wooden boards on the base, and they're just ever so slightly cracked because I want air to be going underneath the work and up and through it and being able to like access and dry. Because if that was sealed on the bottom, the inside would be drying much slower than the outside. So It's definitely like a lot of praying and but just also just like feeling and making sure that things are going as they need to and pivoting. If it's like, oh, this is not drying properly, adding that moisture or those sorts of things and not doing it all at once. So there's a plastic bag on the right side covering the work. So it's definitely like I would come in, clean things up, cover it up with multiple layers, and slowly I unlayer it until eventually it's just one plastic bag and it's just a very slow drying process. And then eventually it goes in the kiln, which is horrifying and very exciting. And this piece, I like to show, you might see there's like the kiln shelf on the bottom, and it looks like it's like a sand. There's a grog powder on the bottom. And the reason that's down there is because porcelain, like all clay, shrinks when it's fired in the kiln. All this water and moisture leaves the piece and the work shrinks. And I made the mistake in the past when I was learning all this of making work and not putting kind of, sand, this grog underneath this, that enables it to shrink and move, right? Whereas if it's just sitting on the shelf, it can catch the shelf and crack. So that's essential, especially because porcelain is one of the ones that shrinks the most. So it can shrink up to 20%. And something that is amazing about that is that it makes it even more detailed because everything gets that much smaller. But it does mean that your piece is going to be smaller too. So like this was a huge work for me to be making something this large. So it was exciting to like create that detailed aspect, but then it lost some of its size. And here are some images of like the final work once it's fired, the front and the back of it. And this was in that group show we had. So many of you would have seen this in person. This is an image of the work when I like first made it in a group show, and I had it with multiple other species, and they were all existing together on this like big 6 foot by 6 foot pedestal. And underneath these glass cloches, for me, which discuss and like show the scientific relationship. I love the reference to science with these glass domes, and I think they're also like beautiful. And then these species that are emerging and covered by these nodes, and all of these species are endangered. So that was kind of the selection of this. And then some of the glass domes were even empty, kind of representing some of the species that are no longer here. And this question of which of these endangered species are going to make it and for how long, and what are we doing and what's our relationship to them. And then the whooping crane in the middle is also on a like wooden cookie tree slice, just like a slice of a tree, and bringing back in that nature, that piece of like nature. So I'm always trying to figure out how to like have scientific reference and human materials, but also natural materials in the work. Um, so I'm partway through the presentation. I kind of like to discuss these big themes in my work, and then dive back into more specifics. I'm going to show a lot of images of like my work installed and just discuss these big themes that I've been touching on. So destruction is a big one, right? That it's kind of chronological here too. I think it was the destruction which I first started experiencing and seeing a lot growing up, and then seeing with like undergrad and those materials I was using with the metal and the wood, that inspired me to question, like, okay, there's all this destruction occurring. What does it mean? And like, what are the layers of it? Um, and that eventually led me to ecological succession, which, if you look up ecological succession, it will be somewhat described as what occurs after destruction. So, if there was, whether it's natural made or not, if there was like a forest fire and everything was burnt to the ground, what are the first, fungi or microorganisms or species that are going to come back as a result of that destruction? which for natural forest fires, that's like a beautiful thing to think about, right? When that's supposed to be happening naturally, and then the new growth occurs. So destruction can be beautiful, and there's this interesting relationship that occurs there, but it's a very fine line, and of course, very different with the human relationship part. Collection and containment is a big theme in my work as well. And that's kind of where you get the Wardian cases, the glass cloches. So much in the scientific world, in order for us to understand nature, we collect nature and we extract it and we study it. But I question that I think that's important, but I also question and think that there's so much more than that. So I think collection and containment is a great way to display this relationship. Scientific and traditional knowledge, I touched on that a bit with my influences, but once again, thinking about how science influences us and our relationship with nature, but also how indigenous relations, spiritual relations with nature, how is that creating a relationship and how are we creating a relationship with nature? Connectivity. Connectivity is when things actually come together. I think it's just a big part of like literally the physical process of working with clay. The only way that this piece works is if every single node is slip and scored and put together. And one piece holds up the rest, right? They're all these essential pieces. Just like in nature and in ecosystems, we are so tied to all these species and animals and the natural process and world, and it's essential to our existence. And I just think that connectivity is showing it in the art practice, but also just thinking about it and being humbled by it and comprehending it as a human is essential. Habitat and habitat destruction is another big theme you'll see throughout my work. In this piece, there are hundreds of little porcelain nests on a wall, and they're all empty. And then there's this singular porcelain nest with a hummingbird on it, on this big, heavy, very industrial metal rod. And just thinking about the beauty of having home and how incredible that is as a human and what we are in fact doing to the planet and how such a huge portion of species destruction is a result of habitat destruction. Here's a close up of that hummingbird and then the metal rod. And this is kind of getting more so to where my work's going now and to kind of the next steps because it's definitely somewhat depressing, the discussion and everything that I'm talking about. So I think it's important to like see this destruction and this beauty and this uncanniness that I like to look at. But I am also a problem solver and I'm interested in change and doing all of these things. So attention is the first step, I think. And I think as an artist, that is something that I do is I draw attention to these events. And I also try to pay attention. So paying attention and understanding the different species, spending the time to respect them and understand them, and just giving my attention and creating a space for other people to give their attention to it by displaying my work and learn about it. And the final theme here is reciprocity. So reciprocity, thinking about how do we get and gain so much from the natural world? How do we give back? How do we have a relationship where there's not just taking, but there's also giving? And that is kind of where I'm at with this, some upcoming shows that I am working on. So, in regards to like this whole path of my making, it eventually led to an artist residency, which I know some other people in this group have done at the Grange Insurance Audubon Center. If you haven't been, it's a beautiful, beautiful center. It's here in Columbus, Ohio, and it's a great opportunity to make work. You get a space and you get to make your work there and meet people who come through the center who are interested in nature or just being in a park. And it was fabulous. It was fabulous to be just working with people and meeting people daily who had an interest in birds. And it also built a relationship that has led to my work now, where I actually do administrative and conservation work for Columbus Audubon, which is not the same as Grange Insurance Audubon Center. It's like the local chapter, but it created that relationship, and it's really gratifying to be practicing as an artist, but also to have connections to the scientific community and so much of the conceptual community I'm interested in working with, to figure out how to bring my art to life and to the public and make any kinds of change. I like to show this from my time there. I was so lucky to have a summer making art in that space. And I learned about lots of things. And one of the things, I'll pull this up first, that I learned about was the Ohio Wildlife Center Hospital, which is here in Columbus, Ohio. And it is amazing the work that they do. They take in animals who are injured and they rehabilitate them, and then, if they can, re-release them in the wild. And one perk about doing the artist residency at Grange Insurance Audubon Center was that I got to ride my bike to the residency every day. And one day I saw a cardinal on the road, and I stopped and I was able to collect it and take it to the center. And I thought, like, nothing of it. I thought, like, this is not going to go anywhere. But crazily, like a month later, they're like, your cardinals recovered. We want to come release them, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So they brought the cardinal back to the area we were in, and we released the cardinal. And they are just, it's an amazing organization. So if you do see injured creatures, there is a resource where you can take them or report them and they can get rehabilitated here in Columbus, which is just amazing. Something I worked on while I was at the center as well, this is in that same artist residency space, is like community project, where those nest pieces I showed earlier, they're very simple to make. And I decided, okay, I want to make a, I called it like a habitat portrait, like a portrait of home, where we collected foliage from the park and the area around. And we made these nests with these plant materials. It's a process where you make essentially a pinch pot, and then you press all of this foliage into it, you dip it in slip, and you fire it. And it was so fun to be making all of these nests with people and to be having these discussions about home and habitat. And then these are some of the community nests that we made. And it resulted in this piece, which you can see at the center if you ever stop in. Um, and yeah, it's great to be making work with the community and discussing these things with people. So I like to show that too. So this piece is at the center. And then in regards to recent work and exhibitions, this was like a huge breakthrough for me. In January of 2023, I had my first solo exhibition, and it was at the Cultural Arts Center. And this is just one of the like marketing materials. And it was amazing. I don't know how else to describe it. But the first thing that I need to talk about is that I could not believe, as you all know, because we all had a group show there. Like, I knew, but I didn't know. Thank God my sister was like, I'm coming. I couldn't comprehend how much work it was, especially to fill a space that huge and to install a really like um involved show. I was so lucky. So I love to show this slide of images of my husband and my sister in here, but also just some really close friends. And I am so lucky that I had this crew, because I was also very pregnant, and I'm so ambitious. So it was amazing to have all of these people help me. I could not have done it otherwise. And it's just good to know that if you ever do install a show, as I know most of you know, like, wow, time consuming, and it's a tremendous amount of work. It makes me appreciate so much when I go to a show and it's well installed. It's like, wow, this was a ton of work. But if you didn't get to see the show, it was great. I like really enjoyed doing it. It was just so gratifying to have that experience, and everyone was so supportive. And this building and this space is just stunning. It's amazing. So it was so cool to have work in a historical space like that. So these are some images of the work I've been showing you all. So kind of on one side, we have the earlier stoneware work that was painted white, exploring different materials. Illustrations were in the background. I started and I have been kind of working with cages and have this is a canary and a bird cage and thinking more about installation. And once again, I do bring like these tree slices. I bring them into my work a lot. It's just such a great representation of nature, and birds live in trees, and it's just like this great way to bring up this discussion and make people think about nature and the natural world. Behind this work is are the line of the nests. And I didn't show images of this just because I didn't know for time wise. But I at the Audubon residency, I started working on, besides the swan, like I wanted to start making pieces that were coming off the wall. So these are swallows, and that's what I did in my time there, and they are coming off the wall. One of those works was in our group show. And the glass cloches and domes and the pieces that were just getting consumed. So that's a little snippet of that. And after that show happened, I was invited to the Roger Tory Peterson Institute. And if you are like a birder in any way, shape, or form, you know Roger Tory Peterson. He was hugely influential to the study of birds and categorizing birds and everything like that. And it was such a pleasure to be invited to this show. There were five female artists who all made work about um, birds and nature. And it was, once again, like, wow, it was just such a gift. So this museum's also in New York. So we made a big trip to New York to go to see this exhibit. It's like middle of nowhere sort of thing. Luckily, it wasn't like too far. We were able to drive. But this building is so beautiful, and they have all of the old Roger Tory Peterson historical everything. And I got a tour of it. And of course, like throughout the town, they had these like marketing materials. It was so cool. It was just a really exciting time in my career, and things kicking off. And the building in itself is stunning. So these are just some images from like the building where it's just like beautiful carpets and a fireplace and high ceilings and just like a stunning building. And it's just such a pleasure, like the Cultural Arts Center, to display work in these kinds of spaces. So being in a group show with other female artists who are talking about science and birds, it was amazing. And one that happened very recently, ecosystems and allergy. This show just finished up, and it was at Tiffin University, which is just a few hours from Columbus, Ohio. And this show kind of was everything that happened between having my baby and now. And I did a hummingbird series during that time. This is one of those pieces. And once again, working off the wall. So pushing myself to try something new and to be working off the wall. These are a few images from this gallery in Tiffin. It's the University Gallery, the Diane Kidd Art Gallery. And I had old work and I was showing the new work too. Behind the whooping crane here, there are five hummingbird pieces on the wall. Um, and I didn't touch on this, I'll touch on it later, but the hummingbird pieces are also incorporating illustration, which is new. So displaying the nests in a new way was exciting. I put them in a circle formation instead of the line. Uh, let's see. And here I have another piece you would have seen at our show, which is the cranes in the wooden frame and the swallows on the left. So showing some newer work, showing some illustration work, and the hummingbirds. So yeah, so now I'll dive into some current work. And what's happening right now in my studio. So I'm going to include the hummingbirds in this conversation about current work. So once again, I like to show, okay, what's the idea? So I was working with the Rufus hummingbird, And I wanted to show one piece in the center, which was the one on the marketing card. And I wanted to have these two hummingbirds kind of like intertwined with the nodes and the growths. And then I wanted to create and add in some color. I brought up before the switching to porcelain. I love the way that the work looks after working just firing porcelain. I do not glaze this work. I one fire this work, and it creates this like very like matte but also visceral texture, and I really, really like it. And when you don't use glaze or paint it, it just all of the details are there. So texture wise, I really like it. And also, I wanted the work to be white because I was trying to discuss this void of life. And for me, coral bleaching is just like the perfect way to illustrate that and the perfect way to reference that. So, because the sea temperatures are rising, when there are coral reefs that are being affected by that, they go from these vibrant rainbow fields to these like white graveyards. And I felt like that using porcelain to show that really, really worked. And yeah, so I at this point I'm like I want to leave the porcelain, I want to leave this white color, but I want to add in white color, but I want to add in color. Sorry, white, not color, but I want to add in color. So I started looking at native plants for the Rufous hummingbird, and this is kind of where my work is going now, is I'm looking at native species and I'm trying to have a discussion more so about what we can do as individuals. So I'm choosing the bird species and I'm trying to choose native species. And then I am choosing and looking at native flora and insects and thinking about which ones we can draw in to attract these birds. So there are a lot of initiatives across the country, but also in Columbus, Ohio, to be planting native species. And that's kind of where I'm at with my work and wanting to promote. So I started making all of these drawings of different native plants for this species, and then I drew them. So these works are they are color pencils. So I was just like, okay, how am I gonna go into this? And I was thinking a lot about like when I go out and I sketch, and I look at birds in the wild and everything, and people who are scientists and who are looking in nature, you go out and you just have the basic materials. You have pencils, pens, erasers, and colored pencils and things like that. And so that's what I was going with. And then I used Sharpie to fill in all around and create this like big contrast. I wanted the white to be on top of this black in color. And I was keeping track of the list of these native species and wanting to display and share this educational aspect at the show. So that's going to be a big thing at an upcoming exhibition I have in 2026. The show is all about native plants and native species. So that's really where my work is going now. And I just kind of started with these hummingbird series. Um, and then this is the final work. So it's a wooden board that's painted black. And then there's the paper is glued onto the wooden board, and it has all of the native plants on there illustrated. And then the porcelain piece is epoxied onto the wooden board. And for anyone who's interested, the way that I epoxy this is with a marine grade epoxy. So it's what you would use to literally repair a boat because I really don't want a huge porcelain piece falling off of a wooden board. And there's also dowel rods that are incorporated throughout that marine grade epoxy in the piece too. So, okay. And then the other new work I was just showed at this Tiffin show in November are these migration love letters. So I think this is just the most succinct way to just explain these. So I'm just going to read these off. But these ink illustrations are made on envelopes that once contained love letters between my parents in the 1980s. Each envelope has a delivery and return address revealing the pathway the letter once took. On the envelopes are illustrations of specific species that use the same pathway as a migration pattern. The age quality of the envelopes and hidden messages show a relationship containing vulnerability, wear, tear, love, time, and travel. Simultaneously, the bird illustrations of the selected species that use the exact pathway the love letters have taken reveal a bridge between human connections and the avian world. Each bird species was specifically selected under the following criteria. So these envelopes have addresses of where they went to and from between my mother and father. And in order to select the bird, number one, the bird migrates between the return and delivery address on each individual envelope. And number two, the bird is categorized as vulnerable according to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List. Um, and then I also have a QR code here to learn more about bird migration. So this is kind of a new project I am partaking on. So I wanted to figure out how to bring more to life my illustrations, and I think talking about migration and also putting them on these historical, very personal documents like creates a new life for them. If you're curious about how I figured out the migration paths, I'm so lucky because there's an amazing resource online, which is the migration path website that the Audubon has. So you can go to the Audubon's website and you can look at specific species, and these yellow dots will move on their website, and you see from like where they travel and where they migrate. It's incredible. It's just like amazing. And I love going to the library and doing this kind of research, but this is just the accessibility is incredible. So this is the long-tailed duck illustration, and then this is a map of that illustration. So I'm getting kind of more and more specific and interested in like education in my work as well. So at this show I'm working on for 2026, I'm interested too in showing, kind of displaying this and showing, okay, how can you learn more about migration? What do you want to learn? And then also listing the native species and whatnot, like I brought up in the last piece. And I'll just go through and show a few more of these illustrations. I displayed them as they are in these images at the show I recently had, but they're kind of evolving. And I have a show in 2025 that is completely focused on these envelopes. And for that show, I think they might be different. We'll see. But I do like these first iterations of them. Um, and of course, for me personally, and I think people can relate to this, like seeing my mother and my father's handwriting, like on this piece, if you look close, it says like hugs and kisses and a little heart on the side of the envelope. And there were all these like little hidden um, love messages essentially that I was finding as I was cutting apart these envelopes. And yeah, I think thinking about love and human relations, but also like love and nature's relations is a good thing to do. I think it creates empathy. Um, so yeah, and some of them still had the postage on it, which was cool. So yeah. Yeah, this one has like a little sweetheart note on the side. Okay, and to kind of tie things up here, I'm just going to show you what I'm working on like today in the studio. And also the process of how I get there. So I was telling you before how I really like to study and think of a species. So this in this case, I selected sandhill cranes. I wanted to select a bird that was native to Ohio, which sandhill cranes are, and was also categorized in some kind of vulnerable or endangered way. Um, and and this piece, this bird I was also interested in because they're birds that mate for life. And, kind of with a love letter theme and tie-in, I'm thinking about love. I just think that's an interesting thing to think about. So sandhill cranes are native to Ohio. They mate for life. These are some images of them. I will look at thousands and thousands of images of the species that I'm interested in, videos to see how they move. Um, if I can see them in person, and try to get some imagery of like close up, far away, really try to understand the species. And the new aspect to the work that I'm doing with this and I'm doing moving forward is I'm thinking about native species. So obviously this is the Ohio bird, like a bird that lives in Ohio. But I wanted to think about what native plants and insects this bird needs in Ohio in order to thrive. So these are just a few. I've been working with many, but oyster mushrooms, American water, plantain, swamp white oak, lion's mane, all of these are in the habitat and or they eat or they in some sort of way they have a relationship with. And I'm using these specific species as the inspiration for the nodes that are going to go on this sculpture. So after I do that, I do a rough sketch. So sandhill cranes, I kind of make a rough sketch of what the birds might look like, what position they might be in. And now I'm getting very specific about the species that are going to be the nodes on the bird, because the hope is that the work is going to be displayed and it's going to have the bird species, the plant species, and the insect species and a way in which if people are interested, they can go get the seeds and plant these plants in their home, like, in their backyards. Um, and I'm collaborating with the Native Plant Backyard Challenge, which is a group from Audubon, the Grange Insurance Audubon Center, that is all about that. They're about a group of gardeners that want to plant native species and attract native species and support the native environment. So, I will kind of just show you how this is evolving. I'm in the middle of it. It's nowhere near done. But I'll show you how far I am currently. So the left piece here, I start by making these slab cylinders that are really thick and bulky. The clay is super wet. You can see the moisture on the canvas board. And, um, and I just kind of, as I've talked about with the whooping crane, it's a very rough start, and then eventually you go in and you start adding details. You have to be careful about how many details you add because you keep handling these works and your thumbprints or the pressure, it's all going into it. So it's just such a delicate balance. And I don't know if I brought this up earlier, but these slab cylinders, which I eventually stack, they obviously make a hollow piece. And the work has to be hollow because it has to dry properly and fire that way. If it was solid, it would explode. So in the kiln. So I have to also hollow out. You might see in this back right photo, there's one of the necks, but it's solid. So I have to go through and cut that open and hollow it out. And here is like the rough and messy beginning part of making and stacking the work. So this is where at one point I adhered a section of the neck. I love how like these kinds of birds, like the whooping crane and the sandhill cranes, like are very serpent-like in a way. I think they're just stunning. And you can see a much more rough slipping and scoring, which I was talking about before, where you crosshatch and really smooth things together. Here's just spending time working on the detail to bring together the the face and the liveliness of the bird. And something I'm also excited about with this work that I have not done yet is making a pillar work at this scale where there are two. So just I decided like, okay, with it being a bird that mates for life, I want to incorporate two species that are interacting in this pillar piece. So yeah, so this is once the pillars are stacked, I'm kind of forming and shaping this piece, and then I am slipping and scoring the pieces together, the neck, the head. And this image shows where I'm going to be putting a wing on. So because I want the whole thing to be about the same thickness, I'm thinking about how thick my clay wing is that I'm about to slip and score onto the work. And if I leave the pillar the same thickness, the wing is going to just double up on it, and it's going to be an inch and a half thick, where the rest of it is only half an inch thick or a quarter of an inch. So that's kind of why sometimes I get to the point where I actually like make a hole and then slip and score it on. And you can kind of see the wings getting kind of coming together here and the tail and these different parts all coming together, as well as the paper towel just to make sure it's not drying out on me. Something that I did for I didn't show you in the last piece is this like amazing and um, horrifying part where I cut the work in half. So I slice this whole thing in half once it gets to a certain sturdiness, and then I smooth out and hollow out the inside, and I try to make it all about the same thickness. And if I don't do that, it's not going to be the same thickness. I'm not going to be able to see what's going on. So this just shows you after I've cut it in half. Half of it was able to stand, and the other half I had to lay down on sponges and clean up and hollow out. And this image you can see on the left is the hollowed out piece, and on the right, it's right after I stuck it back together. So I don't know if you can tell, but right in the center of the photo on the right, there's a scratched up line, and that's where I slip and scored the two pieces back together and made that reconnection. Okay. So, with all those shows coming up, I just wanted to share some of these. So it's an honor to be here, is one I'm so excited about. If you get the chance, please go check it out. It's going to be at the Rife Gallery on January 25th is the opening. It's a Saturday. And that show is going to be so cool because it's a group show and it's all artists who make work about nature. And I believe they're all Ohio artists. So I'm really excited about this show. It's going to be like just right on point with the theme of my work. And then I have Constellation and To Be Determined. I'll be having a group show at Roy G. Biv. So Constellation is a alumni show at CCAD at the Beeler Gallery. And then for the letters I was talking about, I'll be showing those love letters at High Road Gallery in Worthington in the summer. And then the last show that I'm really excited about and just kind of came to fruition is Homegrown, The Art of Living Together. That's going to be at the Dublin Arts Council. And that show is the one that I'm making work for now, even though it's a few years out. And because of how time consuming my work is, it takes me with raising a kid and having a job quite a lot of time to make the work. So it's nice to have a few years to be get working on that, but that will be all about native plants and all those sorts of things. So if you're interested, would love to see you all at any of those. I'll make sure to send those to Dawn and she can share them in the newsletter. But yes, so if you're interested in learning more, my website is here and my Instagram is there too. And just thank you so much for listening to me. I really appreciate you taking the time. So I will escape out of this. And if anyone's interested in asking questions, we can do that. Let's see. Okay.
I have a question. Um, Carmen, do you have to fire your pieces or do they dry naturally?
So the after I sculpt the work, I have to transfer it somewhere where there's a kiln I can use because I don't have a
Oh my
kiln here at home.
gosh.
Yeah, so I think that in the long run, the goal is to get a grant to buy a kiln. So that'll be like the someday and like living in a home, like I just don't know if I would have a kiln in this house where I'm at now, but that's the long-term goal. And I think it'll really transform my work because once the kiln's in the same space as my work, I'm going to be able to push things even further. So I'm really excited about that. But right now I try to move the work while it's still slightly wet to the location, but it's done basically. And then I move it to the location where the kiln is. It has to dry there until it's bone dry. And so it feels like sand. And then it gets fired. And I only fire it once. So I don't do, like I said, I don't fire it a second time and glaze it. Yeah.
Wow. And where do you get it? Is it at the Audubon Center that do they have a kiln there?
I have actually been firing at Capital University because I was
Oh,
teaching and
good.
adjuncting there. So I was teaching there and adjuncting there, and I was firing it when I was there, and I'm still having connections and doing things with the classes there when I can. So it's a great resource right now. But when I wasn't teaching there, and if I'm not able to do that in the future, there is a company in Columbus called the Kiln Room. I actually found out recently that they have like a little thing at the Dublin Arts Council. I just learned that in their basement. But they are one of like there's not many places that will let you come firework, but they're one of the few places where you can pay per weight to firework. So that's a resource if anyone's interested. Yeah.
You sleep at night, or I mean, do you ever find time to sleep?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
How old is your little one?
He is my brain. He's like over a year and a half at this point. He's going to be 2 when I have this baby that I am currently pregnant with. So it's
Busy, busy.
going to be busy. And also like I'm actually like in a trying in my brain, and I feel like I've been learning from lots of people and anyone here who's had children, like just doing a reset of expectations, and that's okay. But if you're really ambitious, that can be hard to do. But I'm like, I need to enjoy these babies right now. They're so
That's
great.
right.
So I am just like I'm really excited about this Dublin Arts Council show, and I think I might try to pump the brakes and just enjoy my kiddos a bit after that. And I enjoy them thoroughly, but like I'm just like, yeah, there's a lot going on. So
I can't believe the floral backgrounds that you're making too. I thought that was a purchased paper that you bought. I
oh
mean, it's
wow.
so beautiful. I
Thank
mean,
you.
did you have a background in drawing or, I mean, your color sense and everything else? It's gorgeous.
Oh, thank you so
It
much.
is.
Thank you. Um, I and for my undergrad program, I did everything. Like I'm sure many of you did that when you were in undergrad. I loved trying out like printmaking and illustration. I explored everything. I didn't find clay until the end, and I'm just like, how did that happen? But so yeah, definitely a little bit of background in that and just looking at the native species and like in order to make it as specific and scientific reference as I want, I was like, well, I have to draw these, right? But once again, that was the sort of thing where I'm like, oh, I'll just draw these backgrounds. And then I start this ambitious thing and I'm like, oh my gosh, people who make drawings, this is so time consuming. For sure.
Is it meditative though? I mean, do you enjoy doing it?
Yes, yeah. I would say I enjoy the clay more. I started missing the clay a lot once I realized I had signed up to make 5 of those. I was like, oh my gosh, I miss the clay. So yeah, clay is just like this wonderful material. I love it. So
And where is the Torrey Peterson, if I have that correct?
I know.
Where
Hold
in
on.
New York is that?
It's I know it feels like the middle of nowhere.
Because maybe
James,
the
but there it's called Jamestown, New
oh,
Oh, it's
York.
gorgeous. That's a beautiful area.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. They're really well known for that Lucy what's that old movie star, her and her husband.
Oh,
oh,
Lucille Ball.
Lucille Ball.
Yes.
Lucille Ball and Dorothy Arnaz. Yeah.
Yeah,
Ah,
so and Roger Troy Peterson is really like a huge thing there. So if you're ever in town, that's displayed everywhere. But it's a very cute little downtown and beautiful part of New York. And yeah.
oh.
There's also, isn't there, oh, I can't remember. We've been doing this again all day. Um, there's an area there that is meant for oh, geez. Um, Roberta, help me. This is where Pat teaches. Pat Snyder does it. She goes to New York right out of sight of Jamestown to do this.
Right. I know.
Anyway,
Yeah. I know what
pardon?
you're thinking of. I'll come up with it.
Okay, between the two of us, we'll do it. It starts with an
of
S.
New York, yeah. State U
Chautauqua.
of New York has a campus there, Jamestown Community, that I graduated from many years ago. And you are right, it is a lovely area on Lake Chautauqua.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Chautauqua.
Chautauqua.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean Emerson and all
Chautauqua
these wonderful
is there.
artists.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes.
So yeah, that's a beautiful, very cerebral academic area.
Yeah. If you are ever driving through for any reason, the Roger Tory Peterson Natural History Museum is so worth stopping at. It is such a beautiful building and they have such cool exhibits and just very cool.
Was he like Audubon as far as with the birds or
Yeah, like
studying them?
he made it accessible to like he was the one of the many people who drew birds and so that people could identify them and made some of the first like bird identifying books for birders, so that people could see just like those books are illustrations, right? And so they could see like, oh, that's what that bird is, and just made these beautiful simplified illustrations of birds.
He is
Are
still
you
very famous in the area. He
Yeah.
really is.
Hmm.
I think you'll be able to probably do a lot of visits to a lot of places who are trying to know more about how, I mean, even with all the wildfires right now, they're talking about there there was some kind of an island where people go to talk specifically about how to actually do something about climate change.
Okay.
And I'm guessing that they would be interested in knowing more about some of your work.
Oh
And
gosh, yes.
I hope word gets out about what you're doing so that they pay for you to go if you want to be able to show some of their things. It's magnificent.
That sounds great.
So,
You're amazing. I just love your work.
Incredible.
Thank you. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to listen. Thank you so much for
Carmen,
spending.
I had a question about, in the very beginning when I introduced you, and you're talking about, that you had been raised in all these places in United States, Canada, Philippines, Japan. Um, were your family in the military or?
Yeah, my father worked for Procter and Gamble, which is headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. And because of that work, we were moved around a lot. And my parents are Canadian. My family's originally Canadian. And so we're from Alberta, Calgary area. And they're
Mm.
they're there right now. They've returned there. So and so yeah, just like a very transient childhood, which I think like all of us are so affected by our upbringing, right? Especially as artists. And it's like I don't think of my work as like portraits or anything, but I do notice pathways that influence us and take us to where we are as artists. And I think it's interesting. I like hearing about where people come from when they introduce their work.
All right, any other questions for Carmen?
No, I was just going to say your presentation was just amazing. I mean, it was just beautifully done, your photography, just the whole hierarchy and just, what the journey that you took us on to see and explore all of the facets of what you're doing and your inspiration. So thank you so much for the time you took to put together such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I
Yeah.
agree.
Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, that was
So
really
I do have a question, Carmen. How is it that you have your parents' letters? How
I know.
did you how did you get those away from them?
I know. So something that's happened after moving so much all of our lives, like every other year and everything, was that my parents have become people who like get like don't want lots of things from because if any of you have moved, you know how much that is, especially internationally. And I remember one day watching them go through their love letters, and they were opening and taking out their love letters, and they just were making a stack of these envelopes, and they were taking them to the recycling bin.
Oh,
Oh,
And I was like, "What are you
oh,
doing?" And I ran over and I grabbed this stack of envelopes and I
for
had them.
you.
Yeah, and I did that like in high school. And it's only in the last, that was over a decade ago. And it's only in the last few years that I'm like, I'm gonna get back to those envelopes. I think I figured out. I'm like, how can
have they seen what you're doing with those?
yeah, it's actually really lovely.
Good.
Recently, they were able to come and see that work in a show. So
Oh, I bet they love them.
yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's so
Curious,
cool.
what's your day job? What you said you have a job. What's your job?
Yes. So for Columbus Audubon, I do administrative work essentially. So if anyone's interested, I run a program once a month that takes place at the Columbus Audubon Grange Center. And that event is where I bring in a scientific speaker just to speak to the community about current scientific events. And it's so amazing because I am talking with different naturalists and scientists, a lot of like professors and people who are doing research. And a lot of this research is related to nature, a lot of it to birds. And so it's just been this like perfect blend of being able to be incorporated in the scientific community and coordinate these events. Um, and and then yeah, and then draw that into my art in any way I can. And luckily, like it's a nonprofit, and I was doing like 20 hours a week. And recently, I asked them, like, with having another kid, I'm like, can I cut back more? So right now, I'm doing like just very part time with them and raising my kiddo and kiddos soon. So I feel very like it's a lot, but it's manageable right now. I think it's going to change once number two comes, but I feel very fortunate to be doing like the work that I'm doing and to be raising my kids. And yeah, it's life is very good. So
Well,
yeah.
keep everything because there might be an Osterman museum in the future.
Someday.
Yeah. Carmen, you are an inspiration to us all.
Oh,
Thank you
Yes.
so much for
Absolutely.
sharing, your process and your work, and it's so exciting to see your future shows. I will make sure that I share that with everybody. Um,
Too.
but thank you so much.
yeah, thank you
Thank
so
you
much for
for
having
being
me.
a part of us. Oh my
Oh yeah, thanks for
goodness.
having me. I'm so glad I met Bev on a whim.
We were getting our picture taken for GCAC. We were sitting and waiting. So we struck up a conversation. And you
Thank you,
had your
Bev.
show at the Cultural Arts Center then. And I
That's
said, I've seen that. That's you? So I
yes.
told you about our group
Yes.
and invited you.
And that's like definitely what I needed then. I think that something that I really like about this group too is that just everyone being so supportive and being able to talk to some other women here who have children and like the journey of being like an artist and having children is so much. And I think thinking about motherhood and all that will be a big thing in the future. And I just really appreciate hearing all of your journeys and yeah. So
Well,
yeah.
as a writer, I can tell you, of a mother of a writer now, it's really neat to watch my granddaughter starting to write. So it's really cool.
That's so cool. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to stop the